One of the reasons why we love history is because of its mysteries. One such mystery is the story of the Dark Age Welsh kingdom of Pengwern. We only know the story of this kingdom from 3 sources, but they allow us to understand the dramatic, bloody, and tragic fate of Pengwern. This small kingdom was very important in the Dark Ages, and it played a crucial role in the battle between the Welsh and Anglo-Saxons for control of England. Its bloody downfall was arguably one of the final events in the development of modern England, which has had such a dramatic impact on world history. Here, we are going to unravel the enigma of the vanished kingdom of Pengwern. Pengwern would be totally forgotten if not for 3 sources. Perhaps the source that is closest in time to the kingdom is Canu Cynddylan, or Song of Cynddylan. This is a set of short poems that are an elegy for the last king of Pengwern. Cynddylan, in fact, the only one we know of with certainty. It was probably written around the 8th century AD, and its reliability has been questioned. Canu Heledd, the Song of Heledd, is a collection of short poems in Welsh. This series of lyrics is unique because, unlike others, they are spoken by a female who survived the fall of the kingdom. The series of poems in a traditional meter is spoken by a distraught and heartbroken Heledd. She is the sister of the mighty warrior king Cynddylan. These verses don't tell us much about the actual destruction of the sub-kingdom or kingdom of Pengwern. The poems are written in Middle Welsh, and this would date them from the period of 1200 to 1400 AD when they were written down. However, it is widely believed by academics that the works were originally composed in the years between 700 and 800 AD by a bard who would recite them orally. We are lucky to have the Canu of Heledd, as they were only rediscovered in the 1600s by accident. The third and last source is only a reference in the work of Gerald of Wales, a 13th century Welsh monk. He wrote a history of Wales, and in his work he references Pengwern only once. Other Welsh sources, such as the royal genealogies, can be helpful in casting new light on Pengwern. To understand the mysterious kingdom, we need to understand first Dark Age Britain, or to give it another name, sub-Roman Britain. Rome had ruled Britain from the 1st century AD until 410 AD, when the last legions were recalled from Britain and never returned. The native population were left on their own as Roman rule collapsed, causing economic and social chaos. Once the last legions had left, the local people had to defend themselves against pirates, invaders, and raiders. So who were the natives? Well, they were often known as Brythonic Britons. These were the descendants of the Celtic people who had lived in Britain before the Roman conquests. Despite centuries of imperial rule, the majority of the people remained Celtic in culture, although they did adopt some Roman ways, especially their model of government. They are regarded as the ancestors of the modern Welsh people. Many of the Welsh, as we will call them, spoke the Celtic language and belonged to ancient tribes. Many of them adopted Christianity, which had become the official religion of the Roman Empire in 310 AD. Now, the Britons, by the early 5th century, couldn't hold back the invasions and raids of their main enemies. These included the Picts from Scotland, the Scots from Ireland, and the German tribes, the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, and others. To defend themselves, the Britons hired some of them as mercenaries. This worked for a while, but only for a while. The Angles and Saxon mercenaries revolted and ravaged the land. The sources from the period are scant and poor. It appears that the revolting mercenaries began to seize land and create kingdoms. This was the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that became the foundation of the modern nation of England. Now, the German invaders were pagan and had little time for the remnants of Roman culture, and indeed believed that ghosts and demons haunted the old abandoned cities. In response to the invasions, the Britons began to form their own small kingdoms based on tribal areas or Roman administrative units. Among the kingdoms that emerged are Damonia, Gwynedd, Powys, and Elmet. Increasingly, the Britons were slowly pushed by the Anglo-Saxons to the west and the uplands, but they still retained control of much of western and northern England. This era is associated with the stories of King Arthur. Most of us are familiar with the king and the magical sword, Excalibur, Camelot, Lancelot, and the Knights of the Round Table. In the myths, we see the brave King Arthur and his knights fighting the invading Anglo-Saxons. Most historians agree that the myths are based on real-life events and that King Arthur was probably a successful British warlord. In 480 AD, according to a British monk, the natives defeated the Anglo-Saxons in the Battle of Badon. The victor in this battle is often seen as the model for King Arthur, who is known as Vortigern. Pengwern would not have emerged but for the Britons' victory at Badon, under the leadership of the man who may have inspired the legend of King Arthur. Now, we know very little about the kingdom despite its great strategic and political importance. Pengwern was on the border between the Welsh in western England and Wales and the Anglo-Saxon territories in eastern England in what is now Shropshire. This was the case for at least a century after 480 and beyond. We know nothing of the dynasty who ruled this kingdom. Its main enemy was the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, which was pagan until the 7th century AD and ruled what is now the Midlands of England. It appears that at times Pengwern, like other British kingdoms, was allied to the Anglo-Saxon states and fought other Welsh kingdoms. However, the balance of power in England was upset by the rise of the powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, and it began to attack the kingdom of Mercia. In 1616 AD or earlier, the Northumbrian ruler Ethelfrith fought a battle at Chester against an alliance of Welsh kingdoms led by Powys. This was a major defeat for the Celtic people who lost many of their leaders. A new ruler of a united Northumbria, Oswald, invaded Mercia and may have become the overlord of Welsh kingdoms, including Pengwern. Now, the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd, ruled by Cadwalladen, allied with the new Mercian king Penda, and they defeated the Northumbrians at the Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633, which led to the death of the king of Northumbria, Oswald. Cadwalladen may have ruled the Anglo-Saxon kingdom for a year, and it's recorded that he was a tyrant. The Northumbrians expelled him around the 630s and were ruled by Oswin. He is a major character in the story of Pengwern. The two poems that are our main sources focus to a great extent on the king of Pengwern, Cynddylan. He is referred to as the ruler of the kingdom. He was the son of Cyndrwyn, who had many sons and daughters, and he may have been the king of Powys, a Welsh king adjacent to Pengwern. It appears that he was a great warrior, but we can't be sure if he was the actual ruler of Pengwern or if we can identify him with the king of Powys known as Cyndrwyn the Stubborn. It appears that Cynddylan ruled Pengwern from about 641 onwards based on Mercian sources, and that his kingdom was distinct from Powys. It is perhaps best to see him as a warlord with a band of faithful warriors. Cynddylan may have been motivated by personal revenge also, as his brother had died in the Great Battle of Chester against the Northumbrians. For many years he helped the Mercians to defend their kingdom against their fellow Anglo-Saxons from the north, as he probably saw them as a greater threat than Mercia. He fought with their king Penda against the Northumbrians at the Great Northumbrian Defeat at Hatfield Close 633 AD, when the Northumbrian ruler was killed. This was to prove fateful for Pengwern. Then something changed about 655 AD. Cynddylan and his army raided the rich monastery of Lichfield in Mercia. This was despite them being Christians and previous allies of Mercia, and during this, the Welsh killed the son of the Mercian king called Pend. This may have been a result of the growing weakness of Mercia, as it had begun to lose territory to Northumbria in the north. Sometime in 666, the English attacked Pengwern. The Welsh appeared to have been attacked with overwhelming power. Cynddylan marched with his army to defend the town called Turn, or met the invaders at the river of Turn, but the exact location is unknown. It appears that he was killed in battle and his army routed, leaving Pengwern defenseless. The Anglo-Saxons then marched on Pengwern, the capital of the kingdom, which was a cairn or a fortress in Old Welsh and not some city or town. The invaders killed all the brothers of Cynddylan and some of his sisters and burned down the halls and all its records. The Anglo-Saxons appeared to want to eradicate the kingdom. In the Song of Hela, the sister of Cynddylan mourns the death of the royal family and she has to live in exile in the hills. Given the sources, we know next to nothing about the origins of Pengwern, but we can piece together evidence from the sources to understand how it came into being. At the start of the 600s AD, among the areas that were controlled by the Welsh was the modern county of Shropshire, located in the west of what is now England and borders Wales. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the tribal identity of the local community may have been stronger than ever. It seems likely that the origins of Pengwern lay in the Celtic past. That area of Shropshire was ruled before the coming of the Romans by the Cornovi. This tribe had dominated Shropshire and the surrounding counties from their hill forts, but were conquered by the Romans about 47 AD. The invaders gave the Cornovi a large degree of autonomy, and the elite ruled the area from the civitas or city of Wrekin. This was in a sense the capital of the Cornovi in the Roman era. The elite became somewhat Romanized, but the majority of the Cornovi kept their identity and their own local customs, and even contributed an auxiliary unit to the Roman legions. There is evidence from the grave of a woman that the inhabitants of the old Cornovi lands still referred to themselves as Cornovi in the 3rd century AD. Despite hundreds of years of rule, Rome had not made a great impression on the native population. As the towns, villas, and estates came to be depopulated, the surviving population retreated into villages and hill forts and lived like their ancestors before the coming of the Caesars. In many ways, it's possible to say that the kingdom of Pengwern was a revival of the old Cornovi tribal territory. With a great degree of certainty, we can state that Pengwern was the successor to the old Celtic tribe that dominated much of Western England before the coming of the Romans. By understanding the inheritance of the Cornovi, we can solve the mystery of the Pengwern kingdom. And it's also possible that refugees from the Anglo-Saxons settled in Pengwern, as well as some Irish settlers, were originally raiders based on the archaeological evidence. The mystery of the location of Pengwern. We are pretty sure of the geographical extent of the kingdom of Pengwern. It was centered on the modern English county of Shropshire, as we have seen, but it may also have controlled portions of the modern English counties of Cheshire, Shropshire, and Herefordshire. It connected the remaining Welsh kingdoms in the southwest and northwest of England, which had resisted the Anglo-Saxons. This is why the fall of Pengwern was so important for the Welsh. Indeed, after the death of Cynddylan, the Welsh in the north were cut off from their fellow Celts and eventually came to be absorbed by the invaders. The great mystery of Pengwern that has intrigued historians and scholars for generations is the location of Pengwern, the court of the king. The kingdom was named after the court or capital of Pengwern, which, as we have seen, was one of the most important of all Welsh capitals. Gerald of Wales clearly states the court was located in modern Shrewsbury, which is the county town of Shropshire. Furthermore, a medieval source states the great king of Powys, Brockwell Ysgithrog, 560 AD, who was overlord of many Welsh kingdoms, had a palace in Shrewsbury, and this may indicate that Pengwern was located in county town of Shropshire in the 6th century AD. One historian, John Waker, believes that Shrewsbury was founded by refugees fleeing from the Anglo-Saxon in the 5th century, and this is in line with the time frame of Pengwern. However, Gerald of Wales was a notoriously unreliable author, and he simply repeated what he had heard and recorded them in an uncritical way. Scholars have generally rejected the idea that Shrewsbury was the location of Pengwern, as there's no archaeological evidence that Shrewsbury was settled in a meaningful way in the 7th century AD. The town only really developed in the 9th century AD, and this was long after the time period of the kingdom of Pengwern and its final destruction in the 7th century AD. And then the Welsh name for Shrewsbury is not Pengwern, even in the Middle Ages, and does not seem to be derived from it. Therefore, we can say with some confidence that Shrewsbury was not the location of Pengwern. Another popular candidate for the location of the court of the mysterious kingdom is at Whittington Castle in the north of Shropshire near the Welsh border. Whittington has been identified with Trefwen, White Town, the famous stronghold of Cynddylan, king of Pengwern. This strategic castle was often attacked by the Welsh in the Middle Ages, and one legend states that one of its owners was one of the guardians of the Holy Grail from the legends of King Arthur. There is no documentary evidence for Whittington Castle as the location of Pengwern, though. The archaeological evidence shows that the castle was built on a Norman manor and that the existing remains only date back to the 12th century. This is much later than the period associated with Pengwern, and furthermore, there is no material evidence of a Welsh settlement at Whittington Castle whatsoever in the early Middle Ages. Now, as we have seen above, the Dark Ages saw the decline in cities and towns. However, many continue to be occupied as fortresses by refugees and the descendants of the original inhabitants. The capital of the Cornovi was at Vericonium Cornoviorum, as we've seen. At one time, this was one of the largest cities in Roman Britain and was probably easy to fortify, as it already probably had some walls or at least earthworks. Today, it is known as the village of Wrekin, and its remains can be visited. Archaeologists have found evidence that the town was occupied until the late 6th and early 7th century. There is evidence from the late 6th century AD that the former Roman basilica was restored and that some town life continued at this time. Some archaeological evidence indicates that Irish in the form of a gravestone may have settled in the former Roman civitas in the 5th century AD. This indicates that Vericonium was in decline but still relatively well populated and probably a centre of trade. This would strongly indicate that the Welsh used it as a fortress or town and thus can be identified with the mysterious Pengwern. On the other hand, there is evidence that despite the period of relative recovery that the site was largely abandoned by the early 7th century, at the latest if not by the late 7th century AD. It may not have been fully abandoned until the 8th century. It appears that during the 6th century that many buildings were dismantled and recycled for use in neighbouring settlements and churches. This would indicate that the former Roman civitas was in decline. It is unlikely that the decaying city was the site of the halls of Pengwern. Moreover, there are local legends and one source that associate Vericonium with the kingdom of Powys. It may have been the site of the court of the ruler of Powys at some time. It is possible that if a king was campaigning in the area, that his court was located here. Now, as we have seen, some have identified Powys with Pengwern as a single kingdom, such as Gerald of Wales. This may mean the Vericonium can be identified with Pengwern. However, the existing evidence from the chronicles show that the former Roman city is no longer the site of a court of Powys. Nevertheless, it is clear the Vericonium was completely abandoned sometime after this by the early 8th century. This would suggest that the former Roman civitas was occupied long after the accepted dates for the destruction of Pengwern, around 645 to 650 AD. In the Song of Heledd and the Elegy of Cynddylan, we learn that Pengwern was destroyed and burned to the ground. The level of destruction recorded in the poems has not been found by archaeologists who have been investigating Vericonium for decades. In fact, the remains of Vericonium are in remarkable shape, and this is why they attract so many visitors to this day. Therefore, it seems unlikely that Vericonium was the site of the fabled Pengwern. In the poem of Heledd, there is a moving passage where she collects her brother's body, the dead king Cynddylan, and took him for burial to the churches of Bassa. This has been identified with the modern village of Basschurch, which is to the southwest of Shrewsbury in the county of Shropshire. The name Churches of Bassa has probably a Welsh origin and may have been the name of a Welsh lord, but there is no agreement on it. The speaker in the poem states the Basschurch has been destroyed and its warriors all gone. One line narrates how Basschurch was in embers. This would strongly indicate that Basschurch was a large settlement, that it was also a religious centre and possibly a traditional site of burial for the elite of the kingdom of Pengwern. It appears that from the poem that it is the land of Cyndrwyn, and this may suggest that it was the stronghold of the family of the last king of Pengwern and the court of their kingdom. There is no evidence of a Welsh or Iron Age settlement at Basschurch, so it's unlikely to be the location of Pengwern. In the vicinity of this former Welsh settlement and modern English village, there are the remains of an Iron Age fort. This is known, as has been known locally, as the Birth or Birth Pool. It is located near Basschurch. It was a hill ground and was surrounded by low-lying marshy grounds, and this may have been the remains of a moat to protect the fortress. Now, we know that Iron Age forts were often reoccupied by Celtic groups in the bloody years after the last Romans left the shores of Britain. This, together with the fact that its near Bast church, would suggest that it had a strong case for being the court of Pengwern. Moreover, there is a local legend that was first recorded in the early 20th century that it's the spot where in ancient times that a great prince was buried along with his fallen warriors after a great battle. Again, this may be evidence that the birth could be the site of Pengwern, but this argument does not really hold. There has not been a great deal of archaeological investigation of the birth. This was mainly because earlier investigations show that there is not much to be found apart from a 1st century Celtic cauldron that is believed to have been an offering to the gods that was found there. This find would support the view that the site was indeed a fortress, but was abandoned at the time or even before the Roman invasion and long before the era of Pengwern. But if that's the case, then what about the local legend of a prince and his fallen warriors being buried at the birth? Well, not all legends are true and are based on historical facts. In fact, there is also another legend connected with the birth that it's the location of the burial of King Arthur, and it was even Avalon, the fabled land in the myth. Therefore, the legend is probably just a story made up by local people with a great imagination. But there is one other candidate for the location of the court of Pengwern, the site of such slaughter in the 7th century AD. There is a hill not far from Wrekin, and it's known locally as the Wrekin. Locals refer to a significant area around the hill as the Wrekin. The hill is part of the Shropshire hill range and can be seen for miles around. It has been established that there was an Iron Age fort on top of the hill that was quite large at some 20 square acres, and it was occupied by the Coronovi. In 47 AD, the Roman legions attacked and captured the hill fort in a brutal battle. The victors moved the defeated Celts to the new city of Wrekin, as we have seen. The hill fort was abandoned for many years. But based on what happened elsewhere in Britain after the Romans left, it is possible that the early Welsh left the old Roman city, or at least a large part of the population, and reoccupied the old Wrekin. They may have done this because of a plague or because the ancient hill fort, which had high earthen banks, allowed them to better defend themselves against the hated Anglo-Saxons. Moreover, in the Song of Heledd, there is a mention of her standing on the Wrekin and looking over the desolate and destroyed land of Pengwern and mourning her dead brothers and sisters. This may suggest that the poet who composed the work believed that the Wrekin was the site of Pengwern. It would appear that the Wrekin is the most likely location for the court of Pengwern, but the evidence is not conclusive. Hopefully, a full archaeological investigation will be carried out at the site so we can know for certain. Yet the evidence, though not compelling, would show that the Wrekin is the best candidate for the Pengwern and was the court of Cynddylan. Before we discuss the reasons for the fall of the mysterious kingdom of Pengwern, we need to know something about the kingdom of Powys. The story of the two kingdoms was intimately bound up. This is because in many ways Powys was an extension, a branch if you will, of Pengwern. The kingdom of Powys was founded sometime in the late 5th century AD in the aftermath of the Battle of Badon. It covered much of what is eastern Wales and some parts of England, and it shared a long border with Pengwern. As we've seen, there was a belief in the Middle Ages, possibly popularized by Gerald of Wales, that Pengwern was the capital at times of the kingdom of Powys before it was moved to Mathravel in the late 7th century AD. This has given rise to another mystery that Pengwern actually was part of Powys, and while Pengwern may have been a court or fortress, whether or not it was a kingdom in its own right. However, the impression in the poems is that Pengwern was once its own kingdom or state in the 6th and 7th century AD. As we have seen, it is probable that Powys and Pengwern were once part of the same tribal state or kingdom in the early Dark Ages, in the immediate years after the Roman departure, but then they divided into separate kingdoms. It is possible that the more urbanized and Romanized people in and around Wrekin separated from the more rural people of what became Powys, whose name may come from pagan or country dwellers. It may have been the case that the rural areas of what became Powys revolted against the dominant government in Wrekin, and this resulted in the two historical kingdoms of Powys and Pengwern. Another possibility is that the original kingdom of the Coronovi that re-emerged after the fall of the Roman Empire was divided into a number of sub-kingdoms. This was a typical political system in many Celtic and indeed Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The king of the land was served by a number of sub-kingdoms who provided them with taxes and warriors during conflict. It may have been the case that at some time in the 5th century, based on Celtic succession rules, that the kingdom was divided between two sons of the dead king. One ruled Powys and one ruled Pengwern. This could have led to the independence of what was to become Powys. It may also help to solve the history of Pengwern. At times, Powys may have been the greater power and subordinated the other one. Then at times, when Powys was the dominant power, the ruler used Pengwern as their court. What we can say is that the relationship between Powys and Pengwern was dynamic and in flux. However, it seems that just prior to the destruction that Pengwern was the dominant power and an independent kingdom. So what was the relationship between Pengwern and Powys in the 6th and 7th century? The Song of Heledd makes clear that in the mid-7th century, the Pengwern was its own independent kingdom with its own royal family. There is no mention of Powys. Now, it would seem on the face of it that having its own royal family would mean that it was independent of Powys. Moreover, it appears from the poem that the king of Pengwern had a noble lineage and his father was a powerful man, and this would suggest that Cynddylan was a member of a dynasty that had ruled Pengwern and was independent of Powys as it was of Anglo-Saxon Mercia. Moreover, the poems also suggest that Pengwern had its own court and archives, suggesting it was a cultural centre. However, the poem was written sometime after the fall of the Welsh kingdom, and it may be simply wrong. There is a tradition, mainly sourced from the death of Cynddylan, that the monarch was a rival of the dynasty of Powys the Cadathing. The genealogical lists show that during the reign of King Cynddylan in Pengwern that there was no recognized king of Powys. In the 7th century, after the death of its leadership on the bloody field of Chester, that kingdom had few, if any, kings recorded in the royal genealogies until the 680s AD, after the presumed destruction of Pengwern. It is possible for us to outline the relationship between Powys and Pengwern. Gerald of Wales believed that Pengwern had been the capital of Powys, but no other sources state this, and as we have seen, Wrekin was one of its capitals also. The smaller Pengwern may have been a sub-kingdom of Powys for many years with its own dynasty that paid homage to the kings of Powys. After the crisis caused by the disaster at Chester in 616 AD, it's likely that Pengwern became an independent state because of Powys' weakness, and that Cynddylan was able to even oust the traditional dynasty of the Cadathing. And we have the genealogy of the kings of Powys, and there is no mention of Cynddylan and his father in the 7th century royal genealogies. This would suggest, as we have seen, that there were two separate kingdoms. But because of the existence of the system of sub-kingship, it is likely that Pengwern or Powys may at times have been a sub-kingdom of each other. We must remember that the Welsh was likely to fight and conquer each other as the Anglo-Saxons. It is believed that the powerful Powys king Brockwell Ysgithrog, who campaigned against other Welsh kings and subjugated them to his kingdom in the mid-6th century AD. He campaigned against his neighbours and became their overlord. It is possible that he may have campaigned against the kingdom of Pengwern. And in fact, some medieval sources, such as the History of Cambrai, state that Brockwell resided in Pengwern and that it was his capital. This may be based on the allusion of Gerald of Wales to Pengwern as the capital of Powys. However, it is possible that given that Brockwell was a conqueror, that he subjugated Pengwern and fully incorporated it into his kingdom. And he may have moved his court to Pengwern because of its strategic significance. This may show that Pengwern was a sub-kingdom of Powys in the mid-6th century AD. This would mean that the dynasty that previously ruled Pengwern had to pay homage to Powys. However, after the Battle of Chester, it's likely that Powys was no longer in a position to dominate the kingdom of Pengwern, and it's also likely that the kingdom of Gwynedd had been greatly weakened. This allowed for the dynasty that had previously ruled Pengwern or even a new one to emerge, and the kingdom once again became independent. It's clear that it was acting as an independent state when it entered into an alliance with Mercia. If Cynddylan or his father was able to secure the independence of Pengwern, they then used their success on the battlefield as allies of Mercia to increase their power. Success on the battlefield meant they had more treasure and they could attract more followers and warriors. Success in battle was the main way a king was able to legitimize their rule. Cynddylan was able to show that he was a great warrior and had achieved on the battlefield what former Welsh overlords in Powys hadn't. Therefore, we can say that in the mid-7th century that Pengwern was an independent kingdom and a force to be reckoned with. By 665 or 666, Cynddylan attacked Mercia and sacked the monastery of Lichfield and possibly killed the son of King Penda. He had suddenly turned on his old ally. But why did he do this? Well, there is the possibility that he had briefly become allied with Northumbria, which was growing in power. But more likely, he just took advantage of the weakness of Mercia, whom his people had often fought in the past to gain some loot and glory. This was the Dark Ages after all, and there was no mercy shown to one's enemy and even one's friends. Oswin, the Northumbrian king, defeated the Mercians at the Battle of Winwade, 655 AD. Penda, the king of the Mercians, assembled a huge army and marched against the Northumbrians with many Welsh allies. One of the warlords may have been Cynddylan. Penda and his allies were defeated, and the king was beheaded. One of the dead has traditionally been Cynddylan, but this seems unlikely. Would Penda have trusted the rule of Pengwern so soon after he had raided his kingdom and possibly killed his son? Therefore, the Song of Heledd is probably correct in saying that her brother died defending his kingdom. According to the poem, he died at Tern, and this is a reference to the River of Tern in Shropshire and not Northumbria. According to our main source, the Song of Heledd, the cause of the raid and ultimate downfall of Pengwern was her tongue. She may have incited her brother to attack Lichfield and the older enemy, the Mercians. Sometime after this, Pengwern was attacked and its territory ravaged. Bastchurch and Tern were both set ablaze, and Pengwern itself was left desolate, and it was possibly never reoccupied. The royal family was decimated, and all the males and most of the females were killed. Now, one possibility is that Heledd is that she challenged or mocked Cynddylan to attack Mercia. The medieval Welsh lived in a culture where reputation and honour were everything. Cynddylan may have attacked Lichfield Abbey, where the cathedral stands today, and attacked his former ally to save face because of his sister's tongue. This could have set up a train of events that led to the death of the king and the fall of his kingdom. Now, as we have seen, the Welsh were often too willing to attack and conquer each other. The alleged brutality used against Cynddylan would not preclude a Welsh king, as the Middle Ages were brutal and violent. However, Powys and the other Welsh kingdoms were too weak after the disaster at Chester in 616 AD. The 7th century was one marked by decline and loss for the Welsh, and the Celtic kingdoms of the Old North were lost forever to the Anglo-Saxons. This leaves us with the two neighbouring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Mercia was closest to Pengwern and shared quite a long border with it. Cynddylan, a former ally, had betrayed them and had attacked a holy site and even killed a member of the royal house. Mercia was in disarray. Its king died soon after the raid on Lichfield, and much of it was taken over by Northumbria under its king Oswin. So while Mercia had the motive, it most likely did not have the means to carry out a devastating assault on Pengwern that left it desolate. The most likely suspect is Northumbria under its ferocious monarch Oswin. He carried on his brother's aggressive policies against both the Welsh and their fellow Anglo-Saxons. Northumbria was a large and rich land and could form a large army, one that was large enough to defeat alliances of its neighbours and to even destroy kingdoms. After the 650s AD, the Northumbrians controlled much of northern Mercia, who'd become its vassal. This would have allowed it to move its army quickly and even from an unexpected direction, and this could have caught Pengwern by surprise and possibly contributed to its terrible and bloody fate. But what motivated Northumbria to engage in such an expedition and to waste the Welsh kingdom? Well, firstly, the Anglo-Saxons hated the Welsh, who were their traditional enemy. Then Oswald may have been motivated by vengeance. His brother had been killed by the Welsh and he wanted vengeance. The Anglo-Saxons still were at least semi-pagan at this time, and seeking vengeance for slain family and kin was seen as necessary and honourable. In fact, if Oswin had not sought vengeance, he would have lost face. As a warlord, he could not afford to be seen as weak. After the death of his brother, Oswald, he may have felt under pressure to attack Pengwern. Moreover, vengeance might also explain the sheer brutality that was visited upon Pengwern. In the sources, it's clear that the royal family was slaughtered and laid waste. The treatment of Pengwern by Oswin was particularly severe. It is stated that he also attacked Powys and other Welsh kingdoms, but he did not destroy them, but rather made them his vassals, which was the norm in Dark Age warfare. The Northumbrians had long had contacts with the Britons or Welsh of the Old North. These were the northern Celts who had formed kingdoms in the aftermath of the Roman withdrawal. We know that Northumbria had relatively good relations with Ystrad Clwyd, a Welsh kingdom in what is now Cumbria and southern Scotland. The Northumbrian treatment of Pengwern was in stark contrast to their treatment of another Welsh kingdom in the north, that of Wrekin. It was annexed by Oswin around 730 AD before his probable attack, and it was treated quite well. Oswin married the daughter of the king, and it appears that the takeover was quite peaceful, and we can even speak of the unification of the Welsh and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. His heir, Elfrith, was born of this union. Now, if the Northumbrians had sought to destroy out of ethnic hatred, well, it seems less likely if their queen was a Celt and Welsh. This would seem to rule out the idea that ethnic hatred on the part of the Anglo-Saxons was a factor in the destruction of Pengwern. Indeed, Oswald, when he campaigned in Wales, did not try to exterminate the Welsh, but as with the case of the King of Gwynedd, who averted destruction by simply paying homage. Now, vengeance was undoubtedly a factor in the destruction of Pengwern, but it may also have been part of strategy. As noted above, Pengwern was small, but it was of great strategic importance. It was a bastion of the Welsh in what was otherwise English-dominated land. It allowed the Welsh to raid deep into the territories of the Angles, Jutes, and the Saxons. Oswald wanted to probably end the threat to Mercia in particular, as he had ambitions to subdue it all. By destroying Pengwern, he would have won, or so he hoped, support from Mercians, especially after Cynddylan's treacherous attack on Lichfield. Furthermore, from the point of view of the Anglo-Saxons, Pengwern was a vital link between the Welsh or Old Britons in the north and in the south, in Cornwall. This would have ensured that the northern Welsh, who were now part of his kingdom, would be less likely to be encouraged to rebel by their fellow kingsmen or receive support from them if they did. The destruction of Pengwern would have greatly strengthened Oswin's hand and Anglo-Saxon control of what is now Western England. Oswin was also able to use the destruction of Pengwern as an example of his power, and he was able to impose his will on other Welsh kingdoms. For example, Powys was obliged to retreat from parts of England that it had controlled for many years, and it may have prompted the King of Gwynedd to avoid battle despite his loss of prestige because of his perceived cowardice. And it may have been a message to Oswin's own Celtic subjects, who had a great deal of autonomy, that if they rebelled, that they face extinction just like Pengwern. After all, it seems likely that a significant proportion of the population of Northumbria was actually Welsh. Interestingly, it's possible that many northern Welsh could have been part of the army that devastated Pengwern. Therefore, it's likely that the Northumbrians attacked and destroyed Pengwern out of revenge and also for strategic reasons. Another question that arises is why Pengwern didn't enjoy a revival like the other Welsh kingdoms after the 7th century. The King of Gwynedd, after the wars and submission to the Northumbrians, enjoyed a period of peace, and the long-reigned King Cadwaladr, 655 to 682, is better known for his prophecies than his wars. Indeed, Powys, after a dark century, was able to revive and to have something of a golden age. Beginning from 655 AD, not long after the purported destruction of Pengwern, it appears that they were able to reject Northumbrian domination, as Oswald had overextended his kingdom and was forced to wage too many wars which stretched their resources to the limit. Powys, by the start of the 8th century, went on the offensive, and this led to the Kingdom of Mercia under the Great King Offa to build Offa's Dyke to defend Anglo-Saxon lands. This dyke was not just a structure to keep the Welsh out, but also a way to demarcate their territories. Offa's Dyke is a testament to the resurgence of the Welsh. But why did Pengwern not re-emerge? Well, the destruction of the Welsh kingdom was such, according to the sources, and the fact that we are unsure about his whereabouts, that there may not have been any state left to be resurrected. The destruction of Pengwern, as we have seen, was terrible, and it all but disappeared from the map. Its fate was similar to that of other Welsh kingdoms in the south, such as Caer, that appears to have been utterly ravaged. This means that it could not enjoy a renaissance such as Powys. Moreover, it seems that a small Anglo-Saxon sub-kingdom came into being following the death of the heroic Cynddylan. This was a Magan Sate, and it was later subsumed into Mercia. But while Pengwern may have disappeared, the native Welsh did not. As elsewhere in Britain, the heirs of the ancient Celts lived in the uplands and poorer areas. In fact, it appears that some of the territory of Pengwern was later taken over by Powys after it had come into the hands of Mercia with the decline of Northumbria in the 660s AD. Survivors from Pengwern were probably able to flee with their cattle and escape to the Anglo-Saxons. During the early years of the Norman invasion of England after 1066, the Welsh rulers of Gwynedd was able to retake some of the lost lands of Pengwern in Shropshire. Records show that Welsh continued to be spoken right up until the 19th century. It is only in modern times that Welsh speakers have disappeared and Shropshire became completely anglicised. In a sense, Pengwern had a long and lasting legacy. So now let's look back on what we've learned. Pengwern was a small but strategic Welsh kingdom in the 7th century AD. It was a successor state of the old Coranovi tribe. Powys was once part of its territory but broke away. It had a long and turbulent relationship with Powys. Sometimes it was dominated by it, and the kings of Powys may even have their court at Pengwern. By the mid-600s, Pengwern was independent and had come to dominate Powys after its disastrous defeat at Chester 616. Cynddylan was the only known king of Pengwern, and he was a great warrior. He was an ally of Mercia before betraying it by raiding Lichfield. The Northumbrian king Oswin attacked and killed Cynddylan and destroyed Pengwern, which never recovered. He did this out of revenge and for strategic reasons. The location of the court of Pengwern was probably at the Wrekin in Shropshire. The destruction of Pengwern was important as it was a fatal blow to the Welsh and marked the ascendancy of Anglo-Saxons in what is now England.